Shavua Tov, good vach, a good week to you, my holy sisters and brothers. Great to be starting it, learning some beautiful Gemara on a Saturday night. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? I think I just got a note from Nina that the notifications on the AT app is not working. I'm sorry about that. We're looking into it. I hope it gets fixed soon. Stephen in New Hampshire, Guy in Ohio, Melissa in Great Neck, Joe in the Inland Empire, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Nancy in North Carolina, Karen in Northern California, and Ella in Southern California, Chaim in Florida, Alan in New York City. Not a short daf. Let's get into it. Our page tonight is 34 here in Tractate Sanhedrin, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1 in chapter 4. And we're talking about how the judges come to a verdict, how the deliberations go. Can they change their minds? We've seen that if new evidence is introduced after a monetary law case where the defendant was held liable or who was found exempt, and then there's new evidence, so they open the case again. In a capital law case, if the judges acquit, and then new evidence comes to light, that would suggest we should execute this person, we don't reopen the case, in most cases. But if they convicted him and he was going to be executed, and then they found new evidence, they certainly would reopen the case. In all cases, except perhaps the inciter to idolatry, the inciter to avoda zara. Okay, that's the general discussion that we're doing. Let's get into it. A few lines from the top on page 34a. The Mishnah teaches, in cases of capital law, one who initially, we're talking about judges here, one who initially teaches a reason to deem the accused liable may then teach a reason to acquit. Right? So when they open the deliberations, right? When the judges are now deliberating, so one of the judges, opens with an argument why they should find him liable, meaning convict, and therefore he's executed. But then he can teach another reason why they should acquit. But one judge who initially teaches a reason to acquit the accused may not return and teach a reason to deem him liable. And Rav says they taught this law only with regard to the time of the deliberations of the court. But at the time of the verdict, one who initially teaches a reason to acquit may return and teach a reason to deem him liable. So we're talking about a difference between the deliberations. Let's say the case ends, they've heard all the testimony of the witnesses, etc. And then they begin the deliberations. And we know that in a capital law case, if they're going to acquit, they can acquit him that same day or that night. But if they're going to convict him, right, passive verdict of he's liable and therefore he's going to be executed, that has to come the next day. So they're saying that one, can change his mind about how he feels, and he can bring a reason, even if he first sort of taught the other judges, here's the law and this is why we should acquit him. The next day, when it's the time of the verdict, if he says, you know what, actually, I realized something that I didn't realize before, I'm going to vote to convict, and here's why, he can do that. The judge can vote any way he wants when it's the time to vote and pass a verdict. But in terms of at the period of the deliberations, if he opens with an argument to acquit, he can't then switch sides during the deliberations and then switch to convict. He can only do that later when it's the time, to finally the end of the process, when it's time to reach a verdict. Although then he could teach a reason, right? So he can change his argument even from acquit to convict at the time of the verdict. The Gemara raises an objection to this from a Mishna in this tractate on page 40. So the following day, i.e., the day after the initial deliberations, the judges would arise early and come to court. And one who yesterday was of the opinion to acquit says, I said to acquit, and I acquit in my place, right? I argued to acquit, and now I'm going to vote to acquit. And one who yesterday was of the opinion to deem him liable says, I said to deem him liable, and I deem him liable in my place. I argued that he was liable, and now I vote that he's liable. And one who yesterday taught a reason to deem him liable may then teach a reason to acquit. Yesterday I argued he was liable. Today I feel that we should acquit, and I'm going to vote to acquit. But one who yesterday taught a reason to acquit may not then teach a reason to deem him liable. And this would suggest that the guy who started arguing for the acquittal cannot change his vote on the day of the verdict and vote to convict. And that would contradict what we just taught a moment ago. So the Gemara now explains the objection. But the following day, that is at the time of the verdict. And the Mishnah rules that a judge who had said to acquit may not change his opinion. So the Gemara questions this reading of the Mishnah. And according to your reasoning, are there no deliberations on the following day? The deliberations may resume on the next day. Therefore, one can say that when the Mishnah teaches that the judge may not change his opinion, it is with regard to the time of the deliberations. Yeah, it's the next day, but we're still in deliberations, and that's why he can't change his mind from acquit to convict. But when we actually get to the final stage and we're going to be voting on the verdict, yeah, then he can change his mind, even from acquit to convict, and that is the law. Now, still staying, that's foreshadowing that that's the law, still staying in the stream here. The Gemara suggests, come in here a proof from the continuation of that Mishnah, which teaches that if the number of judges who deem him liable is one more than the number of judges who acquit, they continue to deliberate the matter. These judges against those judges until one of those who deems him liable sees the validity of the statements of those who acquit and changes his position, as the court does not condemn someone to death by a majority of one. Or perhaps they could change the mind of somebody who votes to acquit to convict, but that's what you can't do in the deliberations, right? He could do that at the time of voting, but he can't do that during the deliberations. We know that you need a supermajority of at least, a majority by 2 judges. So since there are 23 judges in a capital case, 12 to 11 to convict will not convict. You would need at least 13 to 10. If you added another judge, it could be 13 to 11, and you could have a supermajority of 2. Okay. Where was I? And if it is so that one who initially teaches a reason to acquit may return and teach a reason to deem him liable, well, let the Mishnah also teach the opposite possibility. And since it doesn't, that you can't change the minds of someone like that, it must be that during deliberations, you can't change your mind from acquit to convict. And the Gemara explains that Tana is searching for scenarios of acquittal. He is not searching for scenarios of liability. It may be that the law is the same in the opposite case, and you can, during the deliberations, change one of the judge's mind from acquit to convict and get that supermajority. But the Tana prefers to employ an example of acquittal. We haven't figured that out yet. So the Gemara suggests, come in here a proof from a Baraisa. As Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina says, in a case where there was one of the students who argued to acquit, and then he died, the judge died, and the court views him as if he were alive and standing in his place and voting to acquit. And the Gemara asks, but why? According to the opinion of Rav, that a judge may change his opinion at the time of the verdict, let us say, perhaps if that student were alive, he would retract his opinion and find the accused liable. And the Gemara explains, now in any event, he did not retract from his opinion. The assumption is that he would not have changed his opinion, although one can do so. Maybe he would have changed his mind. We don't know. What we do know is what his opinion was before he died. So that's where we hold his vote. So the Gemara questions this explanation. But the sages sent a statement from there, meaning Eretz Yisrael, right, to the community in Bavel. And according to this version of the statement of Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina, he engages in a dispute with our teacher, meaning Rav. So apparently the previous explanation, which reconciles their opinions, is incorrect because they disagreed. So the Gemara answers the tradition was not accurate, and it was stated that he does not engage in a dispute with Rav. So the Gemara suggests, come and hear a proof from a different Baraisa. After the initial deliberations, two judges, scribes, stand before the court, one on the right and one on the left, and they write the statements of those who acquit the accused and the statements of those who find him liable. Right? In the midst of the deliberations, they write, okay, who voted for what and for what reason? Now, this is not to be shared, right, with the defendant later. This is so that the judges can keep track of where they are in their deliberations. So the Gemara explains its proof. So granted, they write the statements of those who find the accused liable, even though they may not change their opinions, as on the following day, they may see another reason to find the accused liable, not the reason they gave before. Maybe they're not changing their vote from liable to acquit or from acquit to liable, but they may change their reason for voting as they do. And once this new reason is given, the court is required to perform a suspension of the trial until the following day, as they may not issue a verdict in cases of capital law on the same day as the deliberations. But what is the reason the scribes write the statements of those who acquit the accused? Is it not because the law is that if the judges would see another reason to find the accused liable, we do not pay heed to them? And in order to ensure that the judges do not change their opinions, the scribes write their statements. So this seems to be two different things that it's saying. If, we have, let's say the vote is going to be to convict. So we know that they can't issue the verdict on the same day as the trial. They have to wait till the next day. They have to sleep on it because maybe somebody will change his mind overnight and save the accused from being executed. Well, the next day comes and one of them says, I'm not changing my vote, but I realize that the reason I gave for convicting him and finding him liable was the wrong reason. I have a different reason. Okay, now we have to wait another day because his vote changed. Even though the result of his vote, right, that still he's saying the defendant is liable, since he gave a new reason, we have to now sleep on it another day. Okay, so what about that? So what is the reason that the scribes write it down? Is it not because the law is that if the judges would see another reason to find the accused liable, we do not pay heed to them? So we don't even accept the new reason. You didn't change your vote from liable to acquit, so we're not going to listen to your new reason. The Gemara answers, no. The reason they write their statements is so that two of the judges should not say one explanation to acquit from two different verses. If two judges each say the same reason for acquitting, but they derive their reason from different verses, those are not counted as two votes. As Rabbi Asi asked of Rabbi Yochanan, if two of the judges say one explanation to acquit from two different verses, what is the law? And Rabbi Yochanan said to him, we count them only as one. Why? Because it is clear that one of the derivations is in error. One of the judges is misremembering the source for his explanation. He knows what the law is, but he's misremembering the source for that law. Maybe both, but at least one of them. So that's why we're going to say that even though they're both voting the same way, let's say to acquit, and they're giving the same reason for their vote, that the law is such and such, but when they cite the source of that law, they come out with two different verses. It must be that one of them is making a mistake with regard to the law and its source, and therefore we don't count his vote. We're not sure which is wrong, but since both are citing the same law and giving two different sources for the same law, one of them made a mistake and we set aside one of their votes. Now the Gemara discusses this ruling of Rabbi Yochanan. From where is this matter derived? Isn't it possible that we could have the same law and emerge from two different sources? In other words, from two different verses in the Torah? Couldn't sages come up with the same law based on two different verses? Sounds like something we've often seen in our journey through the Gemara. Why would we say that one of them is misunderstanding it? Now we're going to explore this with some depth. From where is this matter derived? Abaye says, as the verse states, God has spoken once, twice I have heard this. That strength belongs to God. That's a verse from Psalm 62, verse 12. So Abaye explains, one verse is stated by God, and from it emerge several explanations. But, right, so for sure we could have the same verse give rise to different laws. What we're testing is the reverse, that different laws could emerge, that the same law could emerge from different verses. That's what we're testing. Right, Abaye says, one verse is stated by God and from it emerge several explanations. But one explanation does not emerge from several verses. Alternatively, the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught that the verse states, is not my word like as fire, says the Lord, and like a hammer that breaks the rock in pieces. Jeremiah 23:29. Just as this hammer breaks a stone into several fragments, so too, one verse is stated by God, and from it emerge several explanations. That's obvious, right? I mean, the words of the Lord are so deep and profound that, of course, from one word of the Lord, we could learn multiple teachings as we do all the time. In fact, our tradition says that every verse and every word in the Torah has a minimum of 4 levels that it can teach us. The simple meaning, the hint of something deeper, that's the Peshat is the simple meaning, the Remez is the hint, the scent of something. The Dorosh is like when we dig into it and we realize that it has connections to other places in the Torah and other laws that can be learned. And the Sod is the secret, deepest meaning, which always alludes to some kind of mystical connection. And it's because all these words are from God. They're not from people, right? They might have been expressed through his prophets, but they're coming from God. And of course, they operate on many levels. So of course, one verse can give rise to many meanings. But can one meaning come from multiple verses? In other words, did God repeat himself and teach the same thing twice? That's what we say we don't do. So the Gemara clarifies, what is considered one explanation from two different verses? Rav Zevid says, as we learned in a Mishna, tractate Zevachim 83a, with regard to certain items that are disqualified from being sacrificed ab initio, lechatchila, right? So these things are disqualified. You're not allowed to bring them on the altar. But if you do bring them on the altar, then what happens? So with regard to certain items that are disqualified from being sacrificed ab initio, once they have been placed on the altar, they are nevertheless sacrificed. Because once in matters of holiness, when we ascend, we don't descend. They shouldn't have been brought on the altar. But now that they are on the altar, we let them continue the sacrifice. We don't try to pluck them from the fires of the altar. Why? Because the altar sanctifies only items that are suited for it. As the Gemara will explain, the Tanaim disagree as to what is considered suited for the altar. So Rabbi Yehoshua says, any item that is suited to be consumed by the fire on the altar, for example, burnt offerings, and the portions of other offerings that are burned on the altar, like a sin offering, part of it is burned on the altar. So if it ascended upon the altar, even if it is disqualified from being sacrificed ab initio, it shall not descend, right? So something that's qualified to be a burnt offering, let's say a sheep, right? A sheep, let's say a lamb, but whatever, a sheep, a burnt offering would mean that it is entirely consumed by the altar. If it was brought as a sin offering, parts of it would be consumed on the altar. So a lamb is suitable for the altar. A sheep is suitable for the altar. A goat is suitable for the altar. A wolf is not, right? We don't bring wolves on the altar. So a sheep is suitable for the altar, is suited for the altar. But if that sheep developed a blemish that was a disqualifying blemish, then it would not be permitted to bring it on the altar. Okay, well, what if it was a blemished sheep and somebody made a mistake and brought it up on the altar and it shouldn't have been? Now it's on the altar. Okay, so the altar sanctifies it. It shouldn't have been brought, but now that it has been brought, the altar will elevate its status, and it is consumed, and it's taken care of. The system that God established has taken care of it. It shall not descend. We don't take it down. Once it was up on the altar, we don't take it off the altar. Since it was sanctified by its ascent upon the altar, it is sacrificed upon it. As it is stated, Leviticus 6:2, it is the burnt offering on the pyre upon the altar, from which it is derived, just as with regard to a burnt offering that is suited to be consumed by the fire on the altar. If it ascended, it shall not descend. So too, with regard to any item that is suited to be consumed by the fire on the altar, if it ascended, it shall not descend. Rabban Gamliel says, with regard to any item that is suited to ascend upon the altar, even if it is not typically consumed, if it ascended, it shall not descend, even if it is disqualified from being sacrificed ab initio. As it is stated, it is the burnt offering on the pyre upon the altar, from which it is derived, just as a burnt offering that is fit for the altar, if it ascended, it shall not descend. So too, any item that is fit for the altar, if it ascended, it shall not descend. So the law is the same. Anything that is suited for the altar, if it ascended, it shall not descend, even if it was disqualified. But we're learning out that law from two different verses. Now what they're going to say is, yeah, but we're not learning out the same law from two different verses, because actually those two different verses have a nuance of difference between them, and we needed both verses. Rabban Gamliel said, it shall not descend. So Rav Zevid explained, and what do the two of them include by means of these explanations? Disqualified offerings, teaching that if they ascend, they do not descend, right? A disqualified offering, something that was normally could go up on the altar, but it was disqualified by a blemish. It shouldn't have gone on the altar, but they made a mistake. They put it on the altar. We don't take it off the altar, okay? Both teach the same law. Now, one sage, Rabbi Yehoshua, brings proof for this law from the term on the pyre, and the other sage, Rabban Gamliel, brings proof to this law from the term upon the altar. And this is an example of one explanation from two different verses. But the Gemara questions this example. But there, Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabban Gamliel disagree. And their explanations cannot therefore be identical. As the latter clause of that Mishnah teaches, the difference between the statement of Rabban Gamliel and the statement of Rabbi Yehoshua is only with regard to disqualified blood and libations, which are not consumed by the fire, but do ascend to the altar. As Rabban Gamliel says, they shall not descend, as they are fit to ascend on the altar. And Rabbi Yehoshua says they shall descend, as they are not burned on the altar. We normally don't burn wine libations on the altar. So if that is taken up there by mistake, we do take it off. So they're not teaching the same law. There is a difference between what they're teaching. So we don't have an example of one law emerging from two different verses. So now we're going to try again. Rather, Rav Papa says an example of one explanation from two different verses is as it is taught in a Baraisa. Rabbi Yosei HaGalili says, from the fact that it is stated, and now we're on page 34b, whatsoever touches the altar shall be sanctified. That's Exodus 29:37. Anything that touches the altar shall be sanctified. Okay? I would derive that this applies to every item, whether it is suited to be an offering or unsuited to be an offering. Okay, if a sheep touches the altar, even if it wasn't consecrated to be an offering before, now it is. Well, what if a wolf touches the altar? Does it become sanctified? A wolf cannot be brought as an offering on the altar. So what happens when it touches the altar? The following verse states, now this is what you shall offer upon the altar, 2 lambs of the first year, day by day, continually. Exodus 29:38. That's the daily offering. And that's why we have daily prayer now. In the absence of the Holy Temple, our daily prayer has replaced the daily offering. From this, I derive, just as lambs are suited to be offerings, so too everything that is suited to be an offering is included in this law. Now that Baraisa continues. Rabbi Akiva says, the offerings discussed in this passage are each referred to as a burnt offering. Therefore, I derive, just as a burnt offering is suited for the altar, so too everything that is suited for the altar is included in this law. Now Rav Papa explains, and what do the two of them exclude by means of these explanations? Disqualified offerings, teaching that they do not become sanctified if they touch the altar. Now, this is different, right? If they were brought up on top of the altar, even if they were otherwise disqualified, as long as they are of the type that would normally be offered, we don't bring them back. We let them burn. Here, we're just saying if it touches the altar, right? Didn't go up on top of the altar, just touches, let's say, the base of the altar. So here, we're saying it might become sanctified. Doesn't mean we're going to bring it up, right? So where do we end up here? Hold on. So Rav Papa explains, and what do the two of them exclude by means of their explanations? That disqualified offerings, teaching that they do not become sanctified if they touch the altar. So one sage, Rabbi Yosei HaGalili, brings proof for this law from the term lambs, and one sage, Rabbi Akiva, brings proof for this halakha from the term burnt offering. And this is an example of one explanation from two different verses, right? So they would say that if a lamb, that's a regular lamb, touches the altar, okay, then it gets consecrated. It is sanctified, whether it was sanctified before or not, now it is sanctified. But if it was a disqualified lamb, because it has a blemish, for example, then the mere fact that it touched the altar would not sanctify it. That's the explanation that they're both giving. But Rabbi Yosei derives it from one phrase, and Rabbi Akiva derives it from a different phrase. Okay? So that would seem to be one explanation derived from two different verses. So the Gemara questions this. But doesn't Rav Ada bar Ahava say that the difference between them is with regard to a disqualified burnt offering? The one who brings proof from this law, from the term lambs, holds that lambs, yes, they are included in this law, that if they're qualified and they touch the altar, they become sanctified, and if they're disqualified and they touch the altar, they do not become sanctified. That would apply to lambs. But a bird burnt offering, it would not apply to that. And the one who brings proof for this law from the term burnt offering holds that a bird would be included. A bird burnt offering would be included in that law. So if it was qualified and it touched the altar, it'd be sanctified. If it was disqualified by a blemish and it touched the altar, it would not be sanctified. And that would be the difference between a bird and a lamb. So therefore, it's not the same explanation from two different verses. They come to teach two different laws, two different explanations. So we're going to look for a different example. Rather, Rav Ashi said an example of one explanation from two different verses is as it is taught in a Baraisa, with regard to one who violates the prohibition against slaughtering an offering outside the tent of meeting. Okay, now we're saying in the Midbar, right, when the children of Israel were in the wilderness, encamped around the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the wilderness, and there, beside the tabernacle, there was an altar, right? The original portable altar. And that's where sacrifices were brought by the Jewish people when they were in the wilderness. And Moses taught the people in God's name, and it's stated in the Torah, that when there is an altar to bring offerings on for the people, you can't go bring offerings on some other altar that you made up. Right? There was a time in Jewish history when people could sacrifice on their own altars. They could make an altar. But once there was a national altar, as it were, then sacrifices could only be brought on that. Okay? And if you brought a sacrifice not on that altar, that would be a sin, a big sin, and you would be cut off from your people. Okay? So what's going on? So with regard to one who violates the prohibition against slaughtering an offering outside the tent of meeting, the verse states, whatever man there be of the house of Israel that kills an ox or lamb or goat in the camp, or that kills it outside the camp, and to the opening of the tent of meeting he did not bring it, so he offered a sacrifice outside the national altar. So to sacrifice an offering to the Lord before the tabernacle of the Lord, he didn't do that. So blood shall be imputed unto that man. He shed blood, and this man shall be cut off from among his people. That's Leviticus 17, verses 3 and 4. Now, this verse serves to include one who sprinkles the blood of consecrated offerings outside the tent of meeting. This is the statement of Rabbi Ishmael. And that Baraisa continues, Rabbi Akiva says, that when the verse states, whatever man there be of the house of Israel or of the strangers that sojourn among them, that offers a burnt offering or sacrifice, in Leviticus 17:8, it serves to include one who sprinkles blood or consecrated offerings outside the tent of meeting. Right? So we already know you can't bring an offering on your own altar, not the national altar. Now they're both deriving, and you can't sprinkle blood on some other altar that's not the national altar. You know, the blood sprinkling, that's part of bringing most offerings. I think there's a sprinkling of blood on the altar. So for that particular component of the offering process, even if you brought your offering on the national altar, but then you sprinkled blood on some other private altar, that would be a sin. And they're deriving that law from two different places, right? Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva are deriving that law from two different verses. One from 17:3 and 4, the other from 17:8 in Leviticus. Okay, so Rav Ashi explains, what do these two Tanaim, Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, include by means of these explanations? One who performs sprinkling of the blood outside the tent of meeting. One sage, Rabbi Yishmael, brings proof for this law from the phrase, blood shall be imputed, and the other sage, Rabbi Akiva, brings proof for this law from the term, or sacrifice. And this is an example of one explanation emerging from two different verses. Now the Gemara questions the example. Again, they're teaching different things. It's not the same thing. But doesn't Rabbi Abahu say that the difference between them is with regard to one who slaughtered the offering and sprinkled the blood, as, according to the statement of Rabbi Yishmael, he is liable for only one transgression, and according to the statement of Rabbi Akiva, he is liable for two transgressions. That's a different outcome, and so even though the laws sound very similar, they're learning two different laws from these two different verses. And the Gemara responds, wasn't it stated with regard to that Baraisa that Abaye says, even according to the statement of Rabbi Akiva, he is liable for only one transgression, as the verse states, but in the place that the Lord shall choose in one of your tribes, there you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I command you. There, and not somewhere else on your private offerings, on your private altars. So the merciful one combined all the actions with regard to offerings as one transgression. According to the explanation of Abaye, there is in fact no practical dispute between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva with regard to this matter, and therefore it serves as an example of one explanation from two different verses, And so then you would question why, if judges judging a capital law case would come up with the same reason to acquit or to convict based on two different verses, an explanation like meaning that so that would suggest that one of them got it wrong. Why do we count them as only one vote, not two? This would argue, well, it's possible that there are one explanation emerging from two different verses, and we should count both of their votes. But that's where we leave off that discussion. Now, back to our Mishnah. In cases of monetary law, the court judges during the daytime and may conclude the deliberations and issue their ruling even at night. Now, before discussing this ruling, and this is going to be contrasted with a capital law case where they can hear the case during the day and they can issue a verdict to acquit that night, but to issue a verdict to convict, that has to be the next day. It can't be at night. But before we get to that, before discussing this ruling, the Gemara cites a mnemonic for three of the forthcoming discussions: judgment, answer, incline. And the Gemara asks, from where are these matters concerning the time of the deliberations derived? And Rabbi Chiya bar Papa says, as the verse states, and let them judge the people at all times. Exodus 18:22, indicating that the judgment can be during the day or night. Okay, so is there such a thing as night court for a beis din? Can the rabbinic court hear cases at night? We're going to hear two different views about this. The Gemara challenges this explanation, right? So according to this verse, and let them judge the people at all times, sounds like, yeah, you could have night court. The judges can judge at all times. Gemara challenges this. If that is so, that this is the source of the law, the court should be able to conduct the initial stage of the trial at night as well. Now, we're saying that judge at people at all times. They're saying that's the source for, in a monetary law case, they can hear the case during the day and give the verdict that night. Okay. But the Gemara is saying, if that's your source, well, then the court should be able to conduct the initial stage of the trial at night as well. Yeah, you could have night court. You could hear the case at night and issue a verdict at night. And the Gemara explains, it is possible to resolve the matter in accordance with the statement of Rava, as Rava raises a contradiction between two verses. It is written in one verse, and let them judge the people at all times, indicating that judgment can be during the day or at night. And it is written in another verse, Deuteronomy 21:16, then it shall be on the day that he causes his sons to inherit that which he has. What does that have to do with judging at day or night? Indicating that cases of inheritance, which often come before a court, are judged only during the day. Rava explains, now that's inheritance cases, according to this, can only be judged during the day. That's clearly a case of monetary law. So perhaps we learn out from that all monetary law cases can only be at least open during the day. How can these texts be reconciled? The verse referring to the day is stated with regard to the initial stage of the trial. We open the case during the day. And the verse that includes the night is stated with regard to the verdict. But they can hear the case during the day, and if it's a monetary law case, they can give the verdict that night. The Gemara comments, the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, as it is taught in the Baraisa that Rabbi Meir would say, what is the meaning when the verse states, with regard to the priests, according to their word shall every dispute and every leprous sore be? Deuteronomy 21:5. Right now, here we're talking about, when we say leprous sore, we're not talking about leprosy, like where people's limbs fall off. We're talking about saras. Right? Saras, biblical disease that no longer exists. It was a physical expression of a spiritual malady, most often associated with lashon hara, evil speech, wicked tongue, and people that maybe spoken appropriately, often and long enough, eventually would develop these white sores on their skin, and they would look like other kinds of skin conditions. So you would need a priest, a Kohen, who was expert in determining whether a particular blotch on your skin is just, eczema or acne or psoriasis, or is it saras? If it's saras, then you're going to have to go through a spiritual purification process before you're going to be let back in the camp, let back into your society. You're going to be impure and you have to keep a distance. If you touch things that need to be pure, like teruma, the tithe that's set aside for priests to eat, which has to be in a state of purity and eaten by priests in a state of purity, something that came into contact with a person that is a mitzora, one who has tsaras, would be rendered impure. So it's very important to understand who has tsaras. How do you know if a person has tsaras or not? You bring a priest who's an expert in the laws of tsaras. When does the priest examine the blotch on the skin to determine is it tsaras or not? During the daytime. He needs daylight to make that determination. He doesn't do it at night. Even if you have 1,000 torches to provide the light, he has to do it by day. Okay, what are we going to learn about that? What does that have to do with judges judging cases of monetary law? Where am I? And what do disputes of monetary law have to do with negaim of tsaras, right? So a nega is what these blotches are called. What does that have to do with the blotches of tsaras? So the Brisa continues. Rather, the verse juxtaposes disputes of monetary law to sores of tsaras, teaching that just as sores of tsaras, let's call them tsaras blotches, are viewed by a priest only in the daytime, as it is written, and on the day when raw flesh appears in him, he shall be impure. Leviticus 13:14. So too, disputes are judged only in the daytime. And just as tsaras blotches are viewed by a priest who can see, but not by blind priests, as it is written, as far as appears to the priest has to see it with his eyes. He can't have somebody else see it for him and he describes with words. He has to know what it looks like. It's very subtle. All the cues that a priest uses to determine whether it's tsaras or some other skin condition, he needs to see that himself. So a blind priest cannot judge whether a blotch of tsaras is tsaras or not. So too, disputes of monetary law are or any kind of disputes are judged by sighted judges, not by blind judges. According to this, justice may be blind, but judges may not be blind. And the verse juxtaposes tsaras blotches to disputes, teaching that just as disputes are judged by independent judges, not by judges who are relatives of the litigants, so too, tsaras blotches are viewed by a priest who is not a relative of the afflicted person. Now the Brisa continues. So if these two matters are juxtaposed, why not say that just as disputes are judged specifically by 3 judges, so too, tsaras blotches are viewed by 3 priests? And this would be supported by a logical inference. If a case involving one's money is judged by 3 judges, is it not clear all the more so, kal v'chomer, that the person himself should be viewed by 3 priests? Right? Teaching you that your spiritual condition is more important than your money. To counter this, the verse states, and he shall be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons, the priests, in Leviticus 13:2. And from this you learn that even one priest views tsaras blotches. So in any event, as opposed to the Mishna, Rabbi Meir holds that disputes are judged only during the day. And the Gemara relates, there was a certain blind man who was living in the neighborhood of Rabbi Yochanan, who would serve as a judge. And Rabbi Yochanan did not say anything to him. So apparently, according to Rabbi Yochanan, justice is blind and a judge can be blind too. So the Gemara asks, how did he do this? How did he allow that blind man to judge? But didn't Rabbi Yochanan himself say the law is in accordance with the ruling of an unattributed Mishnah? And we learned in an unattributed Mishnah, Tractate Nida, page 49b, anyone who is fit to judge is fit to testify. But there are those who are fit to testify as witnesses, but not fit to judge. And Rabbi Yochanan says the latter clause serves to include one who is blind in one of his eyes. He is fit to testify as a witness, but not fit to judge. If you're saying that a judge who's blind in one eye cannot judge, Kal v'chomer, how much more so a judge who's blind in two eyes? So how could Rabbi Yochanan allow a judge blind in two eyes to judge cases in his locale? So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Yochanan found another unattributed Mishnah, i.e. the Mishnah here, which indicates that a blind man can serve as a judge. In cases of monetary law, the court judges during the daytime and may conclude the deliberations and issue the ruling even at night. Accordingly, the judging cases of monetary law is not compared to viewing tsaras blotches, which is the source for disqualifying a blind judge. If you're saying that judging can happen at night, that's going to right away distinguish it from judging tsaras blotches. Tsaras blotches can only be judged by a priest during the day. So previously we were saying, and that's how we learned, that judgment can only happen during the day, at least the initial stage of the trial during the day. But if we're going to say that you can judge cases at night, okay, well then there's not going to be a connection between judging tsaras blotches and judging cases of monetary law. And if that's so, well, a priest can't be blind who's going to inspect with his eyes these tsaras blotches, but perhaps a judge can be blind who's just going to listen to the case and doesn't have to see. That's where the argument is right now. The Gemara asks, in what way is the strength of this unattributed Mishnah greater than the strength of that unattributed Mishnah? Why would Rabbi Yochanan rule in accordance with this one and not that one? And the Gemara explains, if you wish, say that an unattributed Mishnah that records the opinion of many sages is preferable, as the Mishnah in Tractate Nida is written in accordance with the individual opinion of Rabbi Meir of the Baraisa. And if you wish, say it is because the unattributed Mishnah teaches this law in the context of the laws of judgment. Since this chapter is the primary source for all laws of judgment, the ruling written here carries greater weight than the ruling over there, Tractate Nida. Now the Gemara continues its discussion of these opinions. And what does Rabbi Meir interpret from this verse, and let them judge the people at all times? Rava said he interprets that it serves to include a cloudy day, teaching that although a priest does not view a tsaras blotch on a cloudy day, the court may judge a case on a cloudy day. As we learned in a Mishnah, Negayim 2:2, a priest does not view tsaras blotches during the early morning when the sun is not in full force, and not during the late afternoon, and not in a house, and not on a cloudy day. This is because a dull white sore appears bright, and a bright white sore is deemed ritually impure. And a priest does not view tsaras blotches at midday because a bright white spot appears dull, and the priest will mistakenly deem it ritually pure. The priest views the tsaras blotches during the late morning or early afternoon when it's not cloudy. That very particular lighting is required in order to make a correct judgment of whether that tsaras blotch is tsaras or not. Are we going to learn out from that what times of day monetary law cases can be heard by a judge? And what does Rabbi Meir interpret from this verse on the day that he causes his sons to inherit? Right? Because that's where we said, okay, cases of inheritance law, which are monetary law cases, have to be heard during the day because of that verse in Deuteronomy. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. So how does Rabbi Meir interpret that verse? Well, he already derived from the juxtaposition to tsaras blotches that the court cannot issue a verdict at night. So the Gemara answers, well, he requires that verse to teach the law that Rabba Bar Chanina taught in the presence of Rav Nachman. And what was that? The verse states, then it shall be on the day that he causes his sons to inherit that which he has. And the addition of the term on the day teaches that it is specifically during the day that you can distribute inheritances, but you cannot distribute inheritances at night. And Rav Nachman said to him, that cannot be the law. As if that is so, then it ought to be that it is only in the case of one who dies during the day that his children inherit from him. But that with regard to one who dies at night, his children do not inherit from him? We know that's not the case. So Rav Nachman suggests perhaps you are stating a distinction between day and night with regard to the adjudication of inheritances. A proof for this distinction is as it is taught in a Baraisa. A verse in the passage concerning inheritance states, "And it shall be for the children of Israel a statute of judgment." That's Numbers 27:11. And this teaches that the entire portion is placed, ure'ah, together to be considered a matter of judgment, subject to the procedural rules that apply to a matter of the court. And this is in accordance with the statement of Rav Yehuda. As Rav Yehuda says, that Rav says, in a case where there were 3 people who entered a room to visit an ill person, and the ill person desires to write a will in order to distribute his property following his death, right? He's very ill. It's like a deathbed bequeathment. I mean, I know I'm forgetting the right syntax of that word. Bequest. A deathbed bequest. Right, so what's going to be the difference between 2 people come to visit the ill person or 3? 2 can only serve as witnesses of what he stated, how he wants his property to be distributed to his heirs. 3 can serve as a court, and they can actually adjudicate that he said to us he wants his property distributed like this and like that, and we're going to do that because they're acting as judges in a court. They can actually issue a verdict of, backing up what this person wants, how he wants his property distributed among his heirs. That's the difference between 2 people visiting a sick person and 3. Right. Where 3 people who entered a room to visit an ill person, and the ill person desires to write a will in order to distribute his property following his death, if the visitors wish to do so, they can write his will and sign it as witnesses. And if they wish, they can act in judgment, i.e., they can act as a court in the matter since they are 3. Therefore, they can determine that the will has the validity of an act of the court and transfer the property to the heirs in their capacity as a court. They can actually make the transfer happen right there. But if only 2 came to visit the ill person, they can write the will and sign it as witnesses, but they cannot act in judgment since 3 are required to form a court. And Rav Chisda says this law was taught only in a case where the 3 came to visit during the day. But if the 3 of them came at night, they can write the will and sign it as witnesses, but they cannot act in judgment because you can't open a case at night. And what is the reason that they cannot act in judgment on the next day? Why can't they do it on the next day? It is because they are already witnesses to the will of the deceased. And there is a principle that a witness cannot become a judge. Since they heard the will and signed it as witnesses the night before, they can't become judges the next day. I.e., one who acts as a witness in a particular matter cannot become a judge with regard to that same matter. And Rabbah Bar Chanina said to Rav Nachman, yes, it is indeed so, that this is what I was saying. That's what I've got for us tonight. And if I'm not mistaken, there are no questions or comments. Let me just make sure. That seems to be the case. Okay, that's what we've got tonight. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Sunday, at the regular Sunday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a good night. Have a great week. Good Vok. Shavua Tov. All the best.